Hi, my name is Peter Constable, and my capstone is on the shape of video and how change affects its content. I began this project based on a desire to explore how changes to a video's frame can alter the viewer's perception. My goal was to explore how different video frame sizes, also known as aspect ratios, can be used to influence a viewer's perception as well as serve as a way to hide information from the viewer. I'm hoping this will provide you with a look at how not just frame sizes can alter your perception, but small changes to film and television can in general. I believe the ability to work with any aspect ratio is one of the greatest tools available to modern filmmakers, and I intend to use this presentation as an opportunity to prove that point. To prove my point, my presentation will provide you with a true understanding of how altering a frame in video production can be used to affect the content of that video, and give a brief history to how aspect ratio has evolved in the last 70 years. I intend to show this through examples of videos I have produced in the last year for my capstone. My work largely focuses on how changing the frame mid-video can change a viewer's perception, while I will use other artists to show how a certain aspect ratio slash frame can be used effectively. At the end of the day, I want people to understand why this is such a powerful tool in a filmmaker's toolkit and show how changing the aspect ratio mid-project can change the viewer's perspective, as the historical change to aspect ratios has also changed the viewer's perspective in ways we never thought possible. What is an aspect ratio? The term aspect ratio is used to reflect the ratio of an image's width to its height. An image with 2 units horizontally and 1 unit vertically would have an aspect ratio of 2 to 1. An image with 1 unit horizontally and 2 units vertically would have an aspect ratio of 1 to 2. This is the ratio of 16 by 9, which is the ratio of most modern televisions and the current HD TV standard. The above image displays how aspect ratio is determined specifically. The ratio of 16 by 9 can also mathematically be simplified to the ratio of 1.77 by 1, and they are often used interchangeably. Common aspect ratios and their uses. To understand how frame has evolved in film over time, I want to take a look back at some of the evolution, specifically as it occurred since the 1950s. This is the standard TV ratio of 4:3, also known as 1.33 by 1. This was the standard ratio in both film and television until the 1950s, when the US film industry developed widescreen formats in an effort to compete with the television, which shared the same standard ratio. These formats widened the traditional aspect ratio to 1.85 by 1 or even 2.35 by 1, which we will explore next. Pictured here is a shot from Season 4, Episode 1 of one of my favorite shows of all time, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Although by now the 16 by 9 ratio was available, most TVs and homes were still in the ratio of 4 by 3, so even shows in the 90s still had to film in that ratio. I chose this shot specifically as an example because I feel it represents the hallway that it is showing perfectly. You feel almost as if you're right there. There's just the right amount of claustrophobia, and I owe that to the fact that this is a narrower ratio. There isn't as much space on the sides as opposed to other ratios. So, what better way to capture the claustrophobia and narrowness of a hallway than a very narrow and arguably claustrophobic aspect ratio? So this is a shot from the first film to come out in the wider ratio of 1.85 by 1, called Thunder Bay from 1953, starring James Stewart. The film was shot in the standard Academy ratio of 4 by 3, but was released in 1.85 by 1 as a result of removing information from the top and bottom of the frame. This is a shot from one of the earlier episodes of Breaking Bad. By the time this show first aired in 2008, 16 by 9, or 1.77 by 1, had become the new standard for television, replacing the narrower 4 by 3. I felt this shot illustrated just how well this ratio was used in that it captures the human frame better than some wider ratios, as it has more height than some of the wider ratios I'm about to show you. Human beings are very vertical creatures, and as a result, to fully and accurately capture them, we require a taller ratio. And I felt that this shot specifically showed just how well that ratio could be used. There's just enough space between both of these men, both between them and on their sides, and regarding headspace, and even towards the bottom of the frame as it fades into darkness, you can tell there's plenty of space uh, between their feet. So yeah, this is a shot that many know and love, and it's my personal favorite shot of all time from the original Star Wars in 1977. I chose this shot as a great example of using a wide frame, in this case 2.39 by 1, for several reasons. Firstly, the frame captures a landscape, which is something that is naturally horizontal and technically encompasses you no matter where you look. As this frame has much more width to it than it does height, it helps to emphasize the wideness of the shot and again makes you feel as if you are actually there in the environment. This is also a great example of filling all parts of the frame, with Luke's home in the foreground to the left, himself in the center on the small hill, and the twin suns setting off in the distance on the far right. This is an example of a 2.35 by 1 film being shown in a 16 by 9 display. I wanted to show this just so you know that when you see films like this, it may appear as if cropping is appearing on the top and bottom, but there's actually no cropping at all here. Oftentimes, films like this are cropped to fill the screen, which in this case would involve removing information from the left and right and zooming in. While this may satisfy the viewer and may use the entire screen, it sacrifices information that the filmmaker blatantly put in there and wanted the viewer to see. So you can argue that while you may be using the full display, the artistic vision of the filmmaker may have been compromised. But in this case, it isn't because the film is uncropped and unedited and it is being shown here in its original ratio. So main body slash, what's the point, Peter? The point I am trying to make is different frames convey different themes and suit different environments. Essentially, video frames slash aspect ratios are the perspective the audience is given into whatever content it is they are watching. By changing that window, we are able to alter the audience's perception. What I intend to show is not necessarily every usage for each ratio, but rather examples of the many ways in which different frame sizes can be used effectively. There are also additional uses for changing the height and width of the frame, such as hiding information from the viewer. So how do you achieve different aspect ratios? Artists have several options when considering aspect ratio. They can either keep the native aspect ratio they shoot in or use post-production to change the ratio. The process of removing parts of the frame horizontally or vertically in post-production is known as masking. This technique was popular in the 1950s, where cinematographers would shoot in the ratio of 4 by 3, but remove the top and bottom of the image in post-production to achieve a ratio of 1.85 by 1. While this process is effective, it removed 36% of the original image. Masking does not often take place during shooting due to the cost of modifying the camera, thus necessitating it to take place in post-production. Another technique that can be used to achieve different ratios is stretching the frame to be wider. While this may not cost the frame any information, it does produce a somewhat distorted effect. This is important to note as the viewer may not find the image convincing if its content seems distorted, unrealistic, or impractical. This is an example of a 2.35 by 1 shot I created from an original 16 by 9 shot. Overall, around 26% of the original image has been masked, with the resolution going from 1920 by 1080 to 1920 by 803. This creates an illusion of a wider space, despite the fact that no additional information has been added to the sides, only taken away from the top and bottom. The original unedited shot from my Canon camera, again, there is no extra information on the sides. As you can see, I only removed information from the top and bottom, which resulted in the appearance of a wider frame. But again, you're really just sacrificing information to make it look like you're adding information. The same shot, but at a slightly different time, this time with information removed both horizontally and vertically. The result leaves the subject, in this case me, in a literal box, whereas cutting information from the top and bottom of the frame gives the illusion of more width. Removing information from the sides removes that effect and replaces it with the opposite, claustrophobia. A 16 by 9 shot stretched slash distorted to a wider frame. While this may have the advantage of making the shot seem wider, subjects or parts of the background may seem stretched and out of proportion, which could potentially negate the viewer's experience and ruin the effect of realism. The original 16 by 9 shot, personally to me this looks a little bit more realistic, although in fairness, I am more familiar with this environment than a viewer around the world would be. So whereas this looks more convincing to me and the other one looks fake, that may just be because I'm familiar with the location. Someone who does not frequent that location might have an entirely different take. So what happens when the ratio changes mid-project? The point of this project, and really this entire experiment, is to show how changing the aspect ratio mid-project can change the viewer's perspective, as the historical change to aspect ratios has also changed the viewer's perspective in ways we never thought possible. The 2014 film The Grand Budapest Hotel, directed by Wes Anderson with cinematography by Robert Yeoman, is a recent example of a project that changes ratio during its runtime. The ratio will change just depending on what time period the film is set in. The film takes place in three different time periods: the 1930s, the 1960s, and 1985 to present. Each ratio reflects the period it depicts, as it was the most common ratio used at the time. For the sequences in the 1930s, the film uses the ratio 4:3, which reflects the fact that this was the industry film standard at the time. The ratio of 2.35:1 can be seen and is used here, and it is not just for aesthetic purposes. This scene takes place in the 1950s, the 1960s, and is meant to reference the evolution of widescreen in the 1950s and 60s, partially in reaction to the growing popularity of television. The ratio of 1.85:1 can be seen here for scenes taking place from 1985 to present. This is done for several reasons. The ratio is between the wider 2.35:1 and the narrower 4:3. This ratio is also the most prominent of our time period due to the rise in 16:9 as the dominant TV and internet ratio. I would now like to show a sample from my Capstone video. It is about a minute and a half long, and in it you will see how it shows aspect ratios changing and affecting the viewer's perspective in significant ways. To conclude, we explored what aspect ratios are to begin with. We showed how manipulating the frame can change the content of the frame, and I showed examples from myself and other artists. I sincerely hope you enjoyed my presentation and it gave you a valuable perspective into how aspect ratios changed over time to affect the viewer's perspective and how that change can be reflected in changing the ratios in projects today. My full video can be found on my YouTube channel and is titled Capstone 2 Final Video. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.